Hello, everybody. My name is JP, and I will assist with the webinar's technical issues. Please mute yourselves during the webinar, and if you need to ask questions at any time during the webinar, please use the chat box. If you hover near the bottom of your screen, a ribbon will appear. Click on the chat option, and the chat box will appear on the right side. Please use this to ask questions, and we will ask the presenters to respond. I will also provide the link for the post-webinar survey in the chat box. The link will also appear in one of the slides at the end of the webinar. If the slides run off or pass the screen, hover your cursor at the top of the screen in View Options and click on the Fit to Window option. Thank you for attending. And I would like to turn this over to Dr. Randy Longenecker.
Okay, next slide, please. So I'm Randy Longenecker, a family physician educator from Athens, Ohio, the Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine, and associate director for Rural Prep. And I will be hosting today's session together with Davis Patterson, who's the director of Rural Prep. We're happy to welcome you to another of our Rural Prep professional development webinars this academic year. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Sharon Casapula as our presenter. Next slide, please. Following a brief introduction, Dr. Casapula will be presenting on our topic of today, and then Dr. Patterson will begin the discussion with some questions, and you will be encouraged to ask additional questions in the chat box. I will be monitoring that, and we will then begin to engage you as an audience with your questions. I will be reading your questions to Dr. Casapula, and we really welcome your participation in that way. Next slide, please. So Rural Prep, for any of you who do not know, is a collaborative for rural primary care research, education, and practice. It's a collaborative of 3 departments of family medicine in North Dakota, Seattle, Washington, and Athens, Ohio. We are funded by the HRSA Bureau of Health Workforce as one of their academic units. Next slide. Our mission is to do these 3 things: conduct research, develop a community of practice around rural primary care health professions education research, and disseminate the findings widely. So our professional development webinar today is one way in which we engage you as part of a larger community of practice around rural health professions education and training. Next slide. The intent of this webinar in particular is to provide faculty development for not only our faculty, but even our students, residents, and others who are engaged in micro-research, for example. It occurs on the 4th Thursday of the month in the 4 months you see there, and our next event will not happen until December. The other months of the year we conduct Rural Prep Grand Rounds, and I'll tell you about that at the end of today's webinar. Next slide. So welcome again to today's webinar. We're very pleased to have Dr. Casapula with us. Dr. Casapula is in our office actually, and is our director for research and education, helps to direct our Rural and Urban Scholars Pathways program. And because of her education background and previous work in the education field, brings a strong portfolio of experience in qualitative research. And we have asked her today to specifically focus on focus groups and how they might be used in qualitative research. So Dr. Casapula, take it away.
Great, thanks Randy. Hi everyone, I'm glad you were able to take some time out of your day to participate in this webinar and focus groups. As Randy said, I work in the Office of Rural and Underserved Programs, and I currently direct the Rural and Urban Scholars Pathways program at the College of Medicine here at Ohio University. My background is in education and educational research, and over the course of my career, I've had the opportunity to facilitate focus groups with a variety of different populations to answer a variety of different research questions. And what I've learned is about focus groups really is that they're harder than most people would expect. Most people might think of focus groups as not a very difficult activity. It's just a bunch of people getting together to have a conversation, and really it's much more than that. So today I was hoping to share some things with that I've learned about facilitating focus groups with you. Recognizing I only have 30 minutes, we're not going to go too deep, so we're just going to cover some highlights and some basic ideas. Here are the I'm sorry?
If you could please share your screen with us, that would help.
Yes, that would very much help. Let's do that. Great. So you should be seeing the objectives. Right now, these are the objectives that I was hoping to cover. I'm not going to read all of these and admit I might have been a little ambitious in creating this list. But basically, I want to cover what focus groups are, when to use them, a little bit about when not to use them, and also about how to use them. So focus groups are a qualitative technique, and as such, as other qualitative methods aren't really they don't really belong within this framework of positivist research that aims towards generalizability or reliability and validity. These things are concepts that really are within the quantitative paradigm, and we're talking about focus groups today from a qualitative perspective. So let's start with a working definition. In basic terms, a focus group is a discussion of a small group of people that is focused on a topic and led by a moderator. So in a focus group, the facilitator takes on a peripheral role, facilitating the group discussion and the interactions between the participants, not between him or herself and the participants, which differentiates focus groups from group interviews. The interaction and the group dynamics are key to the success of a focus group. And we'll talk about what a facilitator can do to enhance that in a minute in the focus group. So why do researchers choose focus groups? They can be used for multiple purposes. Basically, they are used to record, to understand, and explain the meanings, beliefs, cultures, attitudes, perceptions, and feelings of individuals and participants. And they are good for research around poorly understood or ill-defined topics to get a broad sense of how people are thinking about a particular issue or topic. But they can also be used for explanatory research to further strengthen and confirm preliminary data from other research studies that involve other research tools. So here are some questions that you might want to think about when you're thinking about using focus groups. Ask yourself these questions. Do you want a range of opinions, perceptions, ideas, feelings on a certain topic? Do you want to uncover factors that are influencing people's opinions or behaviors? Do you want to understand differences and perspectives among groups of people? Or do you want to pilot test ideas or plans or policies? Or do you need to get a perspective or interpret or inform other parts of a study? These are all good reasons. If you can answer yes to these questions, these are good reasons to use a focus group. Some things to think about in considering using focus groups. You don't want to use focus groups if your goal is to reach consensus. That's not the purpose of a focus group. You're going to have lots of different opinions. If you want to teach or educate, that's again not within the scope of a focus group as it's traditionally defined. If you're gathering very sensitive information, focus group probably isn't the right technique. And also the issue of confidentiality. You cannot guarantee in a focus group really what those participants will talk about or do outside of that focus group. So if confidentiality is very important, then you may want to consider using a different tool like a one-on-one interview. So those are some things to think about. So when you use focus groups, they can be used at different points in a study. They can be used prior to and during other parts of a research study. But again, the research design is really outside the scope of this webinar, so we can't really go into this too much other than to say that focus groups can be used prior to, during, and after other parts of a study. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So in qualitative research, focus groups are often used to inform in-depth interviews. So if you are not, if you want to learn more and get a broad range of perspectives, as we mentioned earlier, about a particular topic, you might do several focus groups and then do an analysis of that focus group data, and from that, develop a list of interview questions that you might want to go more in depth with a certain subset of your sample. Also, oops, sorry here. In a quantitative study, the same thing. Focus groups can be used prior to and help inform survey development or after a survey development. So they're very flexible in how they're used in research. Some things to think about when you're trying to decide whether or not you want to use a focus group. The first thing that you really have to think about is time and cost. So the pros of this, pros and cons here for all of these things, focus groups allow you to gather a lot of information and a lot of perspectives from a broad range of people in a shorter period of time than doing individual interviews, for example. So that's an advantage to using focus groups. However, the trade-off for that is that often the data that comes out of focus groups is less in-depth than what you might get through an in-depth interview where you spend an hour with a participant discussing a topic in more depth. So there's a trade-off, and the decision there would depend on your research question and your design. The other aspect related to time and cost that you have to factor in is transcription. You know, people typically audio record focus groups and then either transcribe them themselves, which is takes a lot of time, or send them out for transcription, which can cost about $1 to $2 a minute, depending on the professional service you use. So that's something to factor into your decision making. Group dynamics, again, has pros and cons. Facilitating a focus group can be challenging, but also really fun if you enjoy that kind of work. Helping to engage your focus group members in conversation with each other is the challenge of the focus group facilitator. You know, you have to really be skillful at that and try, you know, be good at navigating the one speaker who wants to dominate the conversation and make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. So that's challenging and can be exciting, but can also be frustrating. So trying to make sure you keep the conversation on track and geared towards answering your research question is the skill of being a good focus group facilitator. The tool is a very flexible tool, which is a positive aspect of this. You can use it in, as we talked about previously, in lots of different ways with research. And again, I guess I have up here that it's flexible. The facilitation can be fun and enjoyable and engaging, but you know, you have to be careful not to get too off track with your focus groups. And also to recognize that you're going to generate a large volume of data and have a plan for managing that. So how do you find your participants? How do you decide who should be in your focus group? I think one of this quote is very helpful. It's helpful to keep in mind that the purpose of sampling and finding your participants in qualitative research is to reflect the diversity within the group or population under study rather than aspiring to recruit a representative sample, right? That's the goal of sampling in qualitative research. So some things to think about as you're deciding who should be in your groups. You want to avoid power differentials. So if your research is regarding workplace You probably don't want to have supervisors and employees in the same focus group. Same with principals and teachers, students and preceptors. So unless you want to provoke some very controversial discussion and you're going to risk squashing the participants' ability to feel confident and be honest, try to avoid having those power differentials in the same group.
Oh, sorry.
Also, depending on your research question, you may or may not want to have homogeneous groups. For example, you may want to have separate groups for males and females. You may want to have separate groups by age or by job role. So depending on your research question, you would want to think about the degree of homogeneity you want in your focus groups. Same with the level of expertise with your particular topic. How much experience do you want your participants to have with a particular topic that you're researching? So those are some things to think about. The logistics, so how do you do it? There's debate over what the perfect number is, and there really isn't an answer to that, but somewhere between 6 and 10 participants per group. Some people will say that 8 is the magic number. Your design may dictate that you have multiple groups and that you may need to stratify your groups by different variables, by gender, age, profession. For example, you may want to have 3 groups with women, 3 groups with men, 3 groups with students, 3 groups with preceptors, but thinking about stratifying and having multiple groups by a certain demographic variable, for example. You probably want to allow about an hour to an hour and a half per group, not more than that. People will lose interest and get frustrated beyond that period of time, but you want to leave some time so that the conversation doesn't feel rushed, but you do make progress towards answering your research question. I've done a lot of work in rural communities, and I have definitely learned the value of bringing food. Like, you've got to have food. Just have cookies, coffee, water, juice. It helps people feel at ease and feel like they're be a valued participant if you can provide some refreshments at the beginning of the focus group. It also helps to break the ice a little bit. So don't underestimate the power of having some snacks at your focus groups. Also use 2 recording devices. I've learned that lesson the hard way. You always think, I've got it, batteries are gonna work, you check it 3 times, but it's always good to have 2 recording devices going. Don't rely on your phone. Students out there, buy a $30 digital USB recording device. It's really gonna be worth it. Your phones, it's just not a good idea. It's not a good practice. Also, something I've learned is really important. You can use name tags. Some type of identifying name thing is important because you want to be able to say, Randy, what did you think? Thank you, Randy. Davis, what about you? I haven't heard from you in a while. So you want to be able to use people's names for a couple reasons. One, because you want them to know you're paying attention, but also for the recording device, right? You want to make sure on the transcript, you've identified who's saying what. So you want to be able to use people's names. If they've got a name tag that's hanging down around their waist, you're not going to be able to see their name. So using name tents or stickers or something, you want to plan that out in advance so that you can easily use the participants' names throughout the group. It's another little tip that I learned the hard way. All right, let's see. Focus group questions. So where do you come up with your questions and how many do you need? And usually you want to develop about 8 to 10 questions. The sequence of the questions is really important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Make sure they're clear, they're simple, they're conversational. Don't ask them your research question. That's not a focus group question. Your research question is your research question. Your focus group questions are conversational. My advice is practice them. Practice saying the questions out loud to an audience of maybe people that are similar to the population you want to study. You're going to try it out. Make sure they're open-ended because you want a rich discussion. A good technique, if you want people to remember something that happened a while ago, is to ask them first to think back to a time when you were a medical student or whatever. That helps prompt their thinking and gets them in the frame of mind to answer the following question about that particular time you're asking them to recall. So that's a good technique. Also, avoid asking why questions. Those are problematic questions in qualitative research in general because they tend to put people on the defensive, and you don't want people on the defensive while you're trying to build rapport and understand their thinking. So instead, using a phrase like, can you tell me more about your decision making? Or tell me more about what you were thinking in that moment. Something like that is a better way of getting at what you're trying to understand instead of using the phrase why. This is another lesson learned the hard way. And I keep learning this last one, so I'm by no means an expert in this. I'll tell you that off the bat. One of the hardest things for researchers to do, qualitative researchers to do, and I'll put myself in the novice category because I'm still learning, is to ask a question and then stop and wait. Once you've got your list of questions, you ask your question and you stop at the end of the question. Don't explain it, don't give examples, don't expound on it, don't add any junk onto the end of the question that you've just asked, because that will confuse your participants. Once you've asked the question, they're starting to think of an answer. So if you try to explain it or try to give them examples, unless that was part of your question, just let it sit there and give them time to answer. So I'm going to talk now about how you develop your question guide. This is, again, take the time to do this in advance. Think about the sequencing of your questions. You want to ask initially kind of an opening icebreaker type question that everybody can answer. That's a safe, non-threatening question that'll get everybody talking. Something like, tell us about your family. How long have you lived in Athens? What are your favorite parts of this community? Something like that. Something that gets people talking and not necessarily about the topic at hand, but just a nice opening, safe question. Then you want to try maybe to ask an introductory question that gets at the purpose of the focus group. So if our focus group was on, for example, prenatal care in Athens County, this question might be something like, what services are you aware of for prenatal care in Athens County? And then have the group go around and respond to that. Now that might not be the primary goal of my study, but it gets people thinking about the topic. Then you want to ask some transition questions that move that conversation more towards your key questions, which are the questions that you really want answered as part of your study. And then you want to make sure that, whoops, here we go. You want to make sure that you have, at the end, you have a wrap-up question that something to the effect of, what else do you feel we need to know about prenatal care in Athens County, for example? Something that brings closure, but also gives people an opportunity to share any additional thoughts that they may have had over the course of the focus group. So here's some examples of questions, and I know nobody can really respond to me. I'm kind of talking out to the void here, but here's some questions for you to think about. Are these questions really open-ended? And I challenge you to try to answer that question. How satisfied were you with X, Y, Z? Is that an open-ended question? To what extent did you participate in something? How many of you have attended? I would argue, and probably other people could argue in the opposite way, but I would argue that these are not truly open-ended questions, that they could be answered with a number or a quantity. For example, I could answer that first question with very satisfied. So perhaps a better way of phrasing that question would be something to the effect of, tell me about what you found most satisfying what did you find most satisfying about this experience? Same thing for the other two questions. How many of you, or to what extent, did you participate in? I would ask your participants to describe instead of answer a closed-ended question that they can just say yes, no, or very satisfied, unsatisfied. You'll get more. Also remember to pause. 5 seconds feels like a really long time, but people need time to think and remember, so practice that. Time yourself. Count to 5 in your head, whatever you need to do. It's hard, and you'll be so excited about trying to get everybody's perspective. You may feel like this lasts forever, but again, it's an important part of this. Also, good idea to have some probes and follow-up questions at the ready for you if people aren't really responding, and here's some examples of some of them. Tell me more about that. Can you describe what you mean? Can you give us an example? I'm not going to go into this too much, but the real point I want to make here is to practice the questions, practice the sequence, practice saying them, try them out on your friends or whomever, and you'll have a better focus group for having done that. I want to talk about the role of the facilitator because this is critical, right? Like, it all rests on the skill of the facilitator. So it's important to welcome the group, tell them you appreciate their time, set the stage. You can give people a handout with the expectations of a focus group because most people don't really know what it will entail. So go over the expectations. Tell them that you would like the opinions of everybody in the room. And you can even say up front, if one person, my job as facilitator is to make sure everybody has a chance to speak, and if one person dominates the conversation, it's my responsibility to make sure that I'll say thank you, Randy, but we want to hear from everybody else too. So I'll be doing that as facilitator. And say that up front, that way it won't feel so awkward when you actually have to do it. There's a bullet on this slide saying don't show too much approval. What do I mean by that? I think sometimes you have to be aware of your body language when you're a qualitative researcher. You don't want to be a robot, right? You want to be friendly and outgoing, but if you say, yes, that's perfect, that's great, that's exactly what I wanted to hear, obviously you're going to encourage people to tell you what they think you want to hear instead of just trying to be open and receptive. So that's what I meant by that. Your goal again is to create rapport among the group members and get them talking and dialoguing and building off of each other's comments and thoughts and opinions. So playing that role of guide on the side. Redirecting, we've talked about that as necessary. That's your job as the facilitator. And probing for more details and moving things forward if there's dead spots in the focus group. And it's okay to go around the group and ask each person specifically to respond to a question. They're there because they wanted to share their opinion. So don't be shy about calling on them, and they can pass if they choose not to have an opinion, but they're there because they had something to share. So engage them. So what's the co-facilitator role? This is a really important part of again, another thing that I've learned. I don't think I could do a focus group by myself. I think it's just too much work to manage the dynamics of the group and try to take notes and try to pay attention to the recording device and all of the things that you have to pay attention to. It's much easier if you have a co-facilitator and clearly defined roles. So a role that the co-facilitator can play is to make sure the recording devices are still going, because 20 minutes in, you're going to have this panic like, oh my gosh, did that thing actually start? Are the batteries dead? And you don't want to have to do that. So that's the role of the co-facilitator. Make sure those recording devices are working, pay attention to them, take notes on who's saying what, and maybe even take some notes about dynamics in the group, who's talking, capture some important quotes from the participants with their names. Jot down people's names. Also notice that maybe the co-facilitator could be responsible for saying, hey, you know, Davis, we haven't heard from you in a while. If you plan that out in advance, that's the role of the co-facilitator to pay attention to who is not participating as much, then that, you know, that can flow really nicely in the focus group. Or, you know, also using the flip charts, that's another task that the co-facilitator can do. And, you know, and I don't have it up here, but one of the other really important roles that the co-facilitator plays is in the debrief after the focus group is over. You're going to have, as a researcher, you're going to have so much stuff in your head about what just happened. Take 30 minutes after the focus group to debrief with your co-facilitator and talk about what just happened and what you saw and what you heard and what your thoughts are and what your questions are, and do that immediately after the focus group. So that co-facilitator can will also have lots of information to share at that moment too. So that's a really important part of this. This is an example of a handout that I've given focus group participants in the past with just some bulleted items on it with how it's going to work, what the quote unquote rules are. Whew, okay, so that's everything about focus groups. But I wanted to just touch on a little bit about analyzing focus group data, because I know I've worked with other professionals in the past when this gets tricky because everybody does this a little bit differently. I'm not going to say there's a right way and a wrong way, because there's lots of different ways you can analyze qualitative data. Say that up front. All of you qualitative researchers on the call will have lots of different approaches to this. I will say that you can do this through inductive or deductive means. I tend to be a more inductive person, the way I approach research, but again, that's not the only way. There's lots of different ways you can do this. I'm going to show you an example of an inductive approach to analyzing focus group data very briefly, and then maybe I'll get invited back to do another webinar on how to do a more in-depth analysis of how to analyze focus group data. So remember when you're analyzing focus group data that the group is the unit of analysis, not the individual person, right? So that's what differentiates it from an interview. As I said, the debriefing is key. When you're discussing with your co-facilitator, what are you noticing that are themes across the group in response to particular questions? Talk about whether these responses were emerged spontaneously, whether it was prompted by something somebody else said, and what was that prompt, and talk about how the participants responded to each other. Again, my approach is inductive and qualitative, and I don't count frequencies, how often people say things. I don't think that really has a place in qualitative research, and maybe people can argue with me over that, but that's not how I analyze qualitative data with counting and frequencies. That's more of a quantitative approach. But you're looking for themes. You're looking for commonalities and themes across your participants and across the group. So really quickly, here's an example of a data table that was produced in our office here about a small group process we use here called clinical jazz. There's an article that we published, and we did a qualitative analysis of that process. And I wanted to show you this because it shows you in an organized way how things like codes and categories and themes all fit together, because people on this call have probably all heard about, oh, you code your data and then you look for themes and then you bring meaning to that. So what does it all look like? I'm going to try to explain this table here, and you may be able to get some sense of that here at this table. So the codes, right, that we're going to apply to our transcripts of our focus group. We're going to go through our transcripts line by line. That's how I do it. And we might, or a phrase, paragraph, a section of the text of the transcript, and we're going to read that and apply a code to that part of the transcript. And in this example, the code was an atmosphere of safety, for example. That was a code. Or shared challenges, that was a code. An open space for solving difficult problems. Those were all of our codes. So you go through your transcripts and you make all of these codes, and what you start to see is that some of these codes hang together in categories. So if you see in our example here, those 4 codes fit into a category that we called safe space. We also had another category of codes called relationship building, and another one called diversity of perspectives. Those were our 3 categories in which we had placed these codes that we generated through the transcripts. So after that level, you look across rereading the transcripts, right, over and over again. We're looking at what do those codes and categories and the participants, what do those things say to us? What's the theme that we hear in that data? And what we heard was, we called the theme a safe space to hear others' perspectives on difficult topics. That was our theme that we heard from the categories, from the codes to the categories, right? That's the inductive way of going from the data up to the theme. This is not the only way to analyze qualitative data. It's the way I tend to do it. And I wanted to make sure that you understood that focus group data can be analyzed in this way. So that is the end of my very fast presentation on just the basics on focus group research. And I think I do want to point you to this book, which is sitting here on my desk. It's an excellent resource. It is a practical guide, and it really actually is a practical guide for doing focus groups. So if you're going to be doing a lot of them, you should buy the book. It's great. There's some webinars here that I've linked to about qualitative research in general, and there is one that's specifically on focus groups, so I encourage you to watch that. And there's an article about using focus groups in medical education research. So there's some highlighted resources here to get you started. So again, thank you for being present today, and hopefully you learned something.
Okay. First of all, I want to just make sure that folks can hear me. Sharon, are you able to hear me? Okay, then I guess I'm broadcasting all right. This is Davis Patterson, and I'm the director of Rural Prep. And so now I just wanted to take a moment to ask a few questions. But first, I just want to say, Sharon, thank you very much. I think your subtitle was just the basics, but I think this was actually quite comprehensive. It's the most comprehensive overview I've seen in half an hour, so thank you. I just, I'll ask a couple questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I know some of you have already asked some questions in the chat bar, and so we'll have time to get to those. But first, I'm wondering, one of the issues that I've run into, I've done some focus groups of my own, and I've had a situation come up where a group ends up being really small, or we sort of over recruited, thinking that some people wouldn't show up, and then they all show up. And so I was just wondering if you could comment on, how many participants do you think is too many? How many are too few? When should I, call it off or reschedule, or what do you do? If you've had some experiences like that.
Yeah, it's tough with human subjects. They just don't cooperate the way mice do. So it's a problem with every type of qualitative research. You schedule interviews and people don't show, and so it's a challenge, and you have to have a plan for that. And I think deciding that up front with your research team is probably a good strategy. And go with your gut. I think 3 people would probably be a minimum for a focus group, but I don't know. It probably depends on your topic. Depends on the participants themselves. It depends on your resources and your ability to reschedule. So there's a lot of considerations there. That's a hard question to give you an easy answer for. I'd like to hear what you've done. I think too many is also challenging, and my inclination would be to break it into 2 groups and to run 2 focus groups. If you had a co-facilitator with you, maybe you could on the fly split it into 2 groups and have smaller conversations if you felt it was too many. And maybe by too many, I'm talking like 20 people, right? Like if you have 10, we could probably do it. 15, yeah, you're getting too much there. So I would, 15 to 20, I would probably split it into 2 groups. I certainly wouldn't cancel it because you've brought everybody there. So I don't know. Do you have any insights into that?
Well, I agree with you that if you've got people there already, and you can't give forewarning, then absolutely don't cancel it. And these people are giving their time. So I've never had, I think the biggest one I ever had was 16, and I didn't have anybody else. But I think that actually segues really well into my second question, which is about the co-facilitator.
Mm-hmm.
Oops. Are you, I just wanted to check with folks and make sure that you can still hear me because okay. Oh, there I am. Yeah. And my other question, I think, was really about, how many co-facilitators. And I've done a focus group on my own, but I completely agree with your advice about having a co-facilitator, and I've done that as well. And just for the reason you described, if anything happens and you need to, break up the group if it's too big, or so I do agree. How many co-facilitators is too many, though? I've been in situations where there are maybe a couple of co-facilitators and 1 or 2 maybe observers that are sort of on hand. When is it too many eyes?
Yeah. I think you can do it. You can do a focus group with 2, right? 1 lead facilitator and a co-facilitator is probably all you need. I am very sensitive to the whole observer thing, and I think that gets to be a little awkward and I have had situations where people are observing and trying to learn, but they're sitting on the periphery, and it can hinder the discussion because people feel like they're being watched. However, once the focus group, my experience is once the focus group got going, they were very focused on the discussion and tended to ignore the people who were on the periphery observing. So keeping those people outside of the circle, if they're not participating in the discussion, don't have them in the circle, because they're going to feel like, why isn't, it'll start to hinder the discussion and make people feel inhibited if there's several people in the group who aren't saying anything. So yeah.
I might
Okay.
I might just add here that one of the things we've discovered serendipitously with our design dissemination studios is that when we have a large group, we can also use 1 facilitator, but to have them sequentially interact with groups over the course of time. And the rest of the audience then listens as a smaller group of 6 to 8 actually participates. So that's another way to break a large group into smaller sections with just 1 facilitator.
Mm-hmm. Great idea. Yeah. And then the last question I'll ask before opening it up, and so this actually does go beyond just the basics, and so I understand this is a more advanced thing, but given that sometimes in rural research it's difficult to get people that might be geographically dispersed into the same place, what would you have to say about doing an online or virtual focus group? People have been doing this for at least a decade. You can use text, teleconference, or video like this, and it can be really, really useful to get sampling of people that might not be able to participate otherwise. And so I'm just curious, it's sort of an established variation, but what are your thoughts about it, or what considerations would you have in mind?
Wow. So it wouldn't be my first choice, just because of my preference would be to meet people face to face and sit down with them. So I wouldn't prefer it, I wouldn't choose it, but if it's the only way you're going to get people from, like you said, a diverse or dispersed population that can't travel into a focus group and you can't travel to them, then I suppose that it would be challenging to facilitate. It would be difficult to get the participants to interact with each other, because right now I'm talking to you, right? I'm answering your question as the facilitator. So what's Randy doing? He's just kind of nodding his head. But the challenge would be to get Randy and you and the 10, the 6 other people to talk to each other. And that can be really challenging. So I haven't successfully done a focus group online for research purposes. I've facilitated lots of online meetings using this technique. And I know how challenging just that is, with all of the technical glitches that you encounter, and you want to make sure you're recording, and where does the recording go, and, making sure people don't drop off and they can hear each other. There's just so much that can go wrong that, I don't know. So more power to you if you can do it, but it's my bias. I would much rather be in person.
You made a point about focus groups as opposed to group interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Most of what you told us seems to me to apply to group interview as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the online might be more of a group interview. You would just call it a group interview and have different expectations.
Right. Yeah.
We did have a question.
Clearly,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, clearly that's an advanced technique, and I would recommend getting in-person focus group experience first, and then researching it well, and make sure you have a tech person and a co-facilitator. So if that's something you want to explore, there are a lot of resources on the web that you can look at. But
thank you.
But I agree that it's a first. In person is definitely preferred. Okay, I'll hand it over to Randy.
Yeah, well, it's been a great discussion so far among the 3 of us, and we want to bring the audience in. And we have a queue of questions that we want to address. Some of them in follow-up to things we've already talked about. Could you say more about focus groups in rural places? Not just the online option, but what's different? What's different about that?
Well, the first thing that pops into my head when you say focus groups in rural places is the fact that everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody's business in rural places. So that's a challenge. It's difficult to, it's something you have to think about when you're deciding whether or not to use a focus group. If the dynamics of the people in the group interfere with your ability to get the conversation rolling, that can be a problem too. If so-and-so got angry at so-and-so at one, small town conflicts can actually get in the way of you being able to facilitate a group. So those things, you have to be prepared for that. And also the confidentiality issue is more real, I think, in a more of a real concern in thinking about using focus groups to answer questions that could be controversial or sensitive in rural places. You've got to recognize folks might have to travel far to attend your group, so maybe offering them an incentive or a travel voucher or something like that to participate in the group would be a nice thing to offer to your participants.
Good. Yeah, and that leads to another question, and that is how to recruit in a rural place. Is there a time of day or a day of the week that might work better given the logistics of travel in a rural place?
I think it depends on who your participants are, right? So if your participants are seniors, it's a different constituent than if you're working with high school kids or working parents or professionals. So I think you really have to know the population and get a sense for that, and just ask some people who are in that population and say, if we're going to hold a focus group, when would be the best time and day to do it? And it's a good strategy to just ask.
A lot of people think of rural places as fairly homogeneous demographically, but we have all kinds of folks that live in rural places. And the occasion arises where you might need an interpreter. How would you incorporate that into a focus group?
That's a good question. And I've not personally had to do that. But I have actually been an interpreter, believe it or not. I was a sign language interpreter. And so there are certain guidelines for using interpreters. And so if you think you may need one, there are professional interpreting services that you should call on to do that for you. And it's their job to interpret what you say. And you continue to facilitate and focus on the participants, and they will, you might need more than one. Honestly, they usually, when you hire an interpreter for this long of a period of time, you might need 2 of them so they can switch off and be in different parts of the room, depending on what type of interpretation you're needing. If it was sign language interpretation, you would definitely need 2 people. If it was just another language, then you might be able to do that with one other interpreter and plan that out with the interpreter in advance so they know what to expect and how you want to work with them.
It would certainly require more time to accomplish the same body of content that you might want to cover, but you had said that more than 90 minutes might be too long. Any thoughts about that with an interpreter present?
Yeah, I think you have to
food.
Yeah, lots of food,
More
take a
food.
break. You know, you could even break the group halfway, right? Like just say we're going to take a 15-minute break, get some more coffee, use the restroom, whatever, we'll come back and wrap up. So, yeah, I mean, I think it can be done. People will appreciate having the interpreter there, and it absolutely will make it more accessible to the people in the room. So, yeah, that's what I would do.
Great. Can you talk about coding? This is really more of a qualitative research question, but can you talk about coding and how many coders you really need to reach agreement?
Oh, yeah.
The tiebreaker coder, how do you do that?
Whew, Davis was talking about advanced. That's advanced also. That's a whole other webinar. And I would actually like to suggest that we dive into that question on a different webinar. I think that's a really challenging one to answer in a short period of time. Some people do qualitative research by themselves, right? So that's, I'm doing the coding, I'm bringing the meeting, I write it up, it's just me. Some people work in teams of 2, some people work in teams of 6 or 7. So it's really variable, and there's no easy one answer for that. And there's lots of ways, published ways that you can read about that can bring credibility to your qualitative research. And again, that's another conversation, but if you look for resources related to rigor in qualitative research and credibility techniques, that'll help get you towards answering that question.
Well, I want to bring that around to the question about doing this in rural places. My first qualitative research study I did by myself and did all the coding by myself because, frankly, no one else in my community was interested in doing a research project. And so it does have to take a little bit different shape in a rural place. But it can be no less rigorous. And you can also engage people from other places to help you.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things to point out here, again, is thinking from a qualitative frame of mind that the goal here isn't to reach agreement, right? What I see in the data as a researcher, I'm bringing my lens and my life experience and the focus that I have to the data, and I might see something very different from what Randy or Davis see. So the idea of agreement is a tricky one, because everybody's going to be seeing things differently. And yes, maybe you all have the same research question, but your perspectives are going to be different, and you have to reconcile that. But it's a challenging thing to think through.
Well, I want to say, and I think Davis, you may have some comment on this, but qualitative research really fits rural places in ways that quantitative research sometimes doesn't, because the numbers are small. And after our last professional development webinar on qualitative research in December, we had several folks asking for more. And hopefully we will do some more professional development webinars on qualitative research in particular. Any closing comments, Davis, that you would want to make?
Oh, I guess just to piggyback on that, I think, what I love about qualitative research is that, everybody has a story to tell, but particularly I think with populations that are often overlooked in research, and rural populations are frequently overlooked in a lot of the, larger health research, giving them a voice through qualitative research, and whether it's focus groups or interviews or whatever, I think is a really important thing for us to do as researchers.
Absolutely.
I agree. So Davis, could you share our slides again? And what I'll do is just walk you through the last couple minutes of this. Thank you all for participating in our question and answer period. I hope we got most of the questions answered, but if you have additional questions, we'll be giving you some contact information at the end of this presentation, and this webinar will be available within a few days on our website for anyone who is not able to attend today, or any of you who want to particularly look at the slides again. Our next event next month is Rural Prep Grand Rounds, which is a very different structure than this one. It does require people to participate as a group. It's a team-based learning activity. So if any of you wish to participate in our Rural Prep Grand Rounds next month, please go to this link and sign up. But you do have to sign up as a group of people who are actually meeting in person. You can't do it online with all of your members in different places. So just to bring that to your attention. Next slide. We have other upcoming events, topics pending. Rural Prep Grand Rounds again in October and November, and then a professional development webinar next in December. We're looking for presenters in either of these formats. And so please let us know by sending us a message at rprep@ruralprep.org or contacting any one of us, myself or Dr. Patterson. Next slide. There is an evaluation for today's session. The link is in the chat window, or should be in the chat window for everyone. There it is. If you'll just click on that, it will take you to a survey for today's session, and we really appreciate any feedback that you can give us. This continues to evolve. Next slide then, please. Again, here's our contact information. Those of us who are the leads for Rural Prep, as well as Dr. Casapoulos' contact information, and I'm sure she would welcome any personal emails with questions as well. So thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to your participating again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.